What Jesus revealed about staying strong in hard times doesn't look anything like what you expected, does it? Because right now, you don't feel strong. You feel tired, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. You're trying to hold on, trying to pray, trying to believe, but it feels like your words are hitting the ceiling. And in the silence, a question keeps creeping in. What if I'm not strong enough for this? You thought strength would feel like peace, like clarity, like confidence. But instead, your mind won't slow down. Your heart feels heavy, and the distance between what you believe and what you feel is getting harder to ignore. And the worst part, you're starting to wonder if this means something is wrong with your faith. Or worse, something is wrong between you and God. But what if everything you've been using to measure your strength is completely wrong? What if the way Jesus defines strength begins exactly where you feel the weakest? You've been carrying something heavy for a while now, and maybe no one around you fully sees it. It's not just physical tiredness, it's deeper than that. It's the kind of exhaustion that settles into your thoughts, your emotions, your spirit. You wake up already feeling behind, already feeling like your mind is racing faster than your strength can keep up. And no matter how much you try to push through, something inside you keeps whispering, I don't know if I can keep doing this. Your thoughts don't slow down. They move from one worry to another: your future, your responsibilities, your purpose, the things you thought would have worked out by now but didn't. And in the middle of all that noise, you try to pray, you really do. You're trying to reach for God, to say the right words, to believe the right things, but it feels like your prayers barely leave the room. And that's where the confusion begins, because you do believe in God. You do have faith. At least you thought you did, but now you're starting to question things you never questioned before. Not out loud, maybe, but quietly, internally. You wonder if God hears you. You wonder if He's paying attention. And sometimes, if you're honest, you even wonder if you're doing something wrong, like maybe the reason you feel this way is because your faith isn't strong enough. That thought, it lingers. What if I'm not strong enough for this? It doesn't come as a loud voice. It's subtle. It shows up in moments when you feel overwhelmed for no clear reason, when your emotions feel heavier than they should, when small problems feel like too much, when your energy disappears faster than it should, and suddenly, you're not just dealing with life, you're also dealing with the fear that you're not equipped to handle it. And that fear starts to shape the way you see everything. You start measuring your faith based on how you feel. If you feel peaceful, you think you're doing okay. If you feel anxious, you assume something is wrong. If you feel strong, you believe God is near. But if you feel weak, it feels like distance, like disconnection, like maybe God stepped back without telling you. But what if that's not true? What if the way you've been measuring strength isn't actually the way God defines it? Because right now, it feels like strength should look like confidence, like clarity, like having your emotions under control, like waking up with peace and going to sleep without fear. That's what you've been hoping for, right? That at some point, things would just settle. Your mind would quiet down. Your heart would stop carrying so much weight. But instead, you're here, still fighting thoughts, still feeling uncertain, still trying to hold on to faith while everything inside you feels unstable. And that creates a tension that's hard to explain. On one side, there's what you believe. You've heard the truth. You know that God is good. You know that He is in control. You know that He has a plan. You've probably reminded yourself of these things more times than you can count. But on the other side, there's what you feel. And what you feel doesn't always match what you know. You feel anxious, even though you believe God is in control. You feel alone, even though you believe He is with you. You feel uncertain, even though you believe He has a plan. And that gap between truth and emotion, it's exhausting to live in. It makes you question yourself. Why can't I just trust God the way I'm supposed to? And maybe you've tried to fix it. Maybe you've told yourself to just have more faith, to pray more, to think more positively, to stop worrying so much. But the harder you try, the more it feels like you're forcing something that won't come naturally right now. And that's where discouragement begins to grow. Because if faith feels hard, does that mean you're failing? If you feel weak, does that mean your faith is weak too? That question sits deeper than you realize. Because it doesn't just affect how you see yourself, it affects how you see God. If strength depends on how you feel, then every moment of weakness feels like distance from Him. Like you're slipping, like you're falling behind spiritually. But what if the entire foundation of that belief is flawed? What if strength was never meant to come from your feelings in the first place? That idea might feel unfamiliar, maybe even uncomfortable, because it challenges everything you've been using to measure your spiritual life. It challenges the idea that peace always feels peaceful, that faith always feels strong, that trust always feels certain. But if that were true, then why do so many people in Scripture walk through seasons of doubt, fear, and waiting? Why would God allow moments where nothing makes sense, where emotions feel overwhelming, where answers don't come when you expect them? Could it be that what you're experiencing right now is not a sign of failure, but part of something deeper? Because here's the tension you're sitting in. You're trying to feel strong, while God may be teaching you something completely different about what strength actually is. And until that shifts, this struggle will keep feeling confusing. So the real question isn't just, why do I feel this way? The real question is, what if strength doesn't come from feeling strong at all? There is a quiet assumption that has been shaping the way you see yourself, and you may not have even noticed it. It's the belief that strength is something you should feel. That if your faith is real, you should feel confident. If your trust is solid, you should feel calm. If God is with you, you should feel at peace. But what happens when none of those feelings are there? This is where the struggle deepens. Because instead of just dealing with anxiety or fear or uncertainty, start interpreting those feelings as proof of something. Proof that you're not strong enough. Proof that your faith isn't where it should be. Proof that something is off between you and God. And without realizing it, you begin to carry a second burden on top of the first. Not only are you overwhelmed, now you're also questioning yourself for being overwhelmed. But here's what needs to shift. Strength was never meant to be defined by your emotions. That might feel strange at first, because emotions are loud. They demand your attention. When anxiety rises, it doesn't feel small, it feels consuming. When fear shows up, it doesn't feel optional, it feels real. So naturally, it seems like those feelings must reflect something true about your condition. But emotions, as powerful as they are, were never designed to be your foundation. They are responses, not anchors. And this is where many people get stuck. Because when emotions become the measure of strength, your entire spiritual life becomes unstable. One day you feel close to God. The next day you feel distant. One moment you feel hopeful. The next you feel discouraged. And it creates this constant cycle where your sense of faith rises and falls based on what's happening inside your mind. But God never intended for your relationship with Him to be built on something that unstable. Real strength, the kind that holds you together when everything feels like it's falling apart, is not emotional, it's spiritual. And spiritual strength often looks very different than what you expected. It doesn't always feel powerful. It doesn't always feel confident. Sometimes it doesn't even feel noticeable at all. Sometimes spiritual strength looks like continuing, even when your emotions are telling you to give up. It looks like choosing to trust, even when your thoughts are filled with doubt. It looks like showing up in prayer, even when you don't feel anything. That's not weakness. That's strength in its purest form. But here's the part that's easy to miss. If you've been expecting strength to feel a certain way, you might completely overlook the fact that you're already walking in it. Think about it. You're still here, still searching, still trying to understand, still holding on to God, even if it feels fragile, even if your faith feels small, even if your prayers feel uncertain. Why? Because something deeper than your emotions is still active inside you. And that something is where real strength comes from. There's a moment in Scripture where this truth becomes very clear. It reminds us that God's power is not revealed through human confidence or emotional stability, but through something unexpected: weakness itself. Not because weakness is the goal, but because it creates space for something greater than your own ability. That means your current state, the exhaustion, the uncertainty, the emotional weight you're carrying. It doesn't disqualify you from being strong. It might actually be the very place where true strength is being formed. But this raises a question that might feel uncomfortable. If strength doesn't come from how you feel, then why do your feelings still have so much power over you? Why does fear feel so convincing? Why does anxiety feel so real? Why is it so hard to separate what you know is true from what you feel in the moment? This is where the tension continues. Because even if you begin to understand that strength is not emotional, you still have to live inside your mind. You still have to face the thoughts that show up uninvited, the worst case scenarios, the constant mental noise that doesn't just disappear because you've decided to trust God. So now you're standing between two realities. You're beginning to see that your feelings are not the source of your strength, but they're still influencing your experience. And that leads to a deeper question. If your emotions aren't the foundation, then what is? What does it actually look like to live with spiritual strength when your mind feels overwhelmed? Because understanding the truth is one thing, but leaving it when everything inside you feels the opposite, that's where the real battle begins. There's a moment in your journey where the silence becomes louder than the noise. At first, it was just confusion. You didn't understand why things felt the way they did. But now, it feels deeper than that. Now, it feels like distance. Like you're reaching for God, but there's nothing tangible coming back. No clear direction. No strong sense of peace. No immediate answer. Just silence. And if you stay in that space long enough, a subtle thought begins to form. If God is really here, why does it feel like He isn't? That question doesn't come from rebellion. It comes from longing. From the part of you that genuinely wants to feel close to God again. The part that misses clarity. The part that remembers what it felt like to be sure. And wonders why that certainty feels so far away now. But here's where the misunderstanding begins to take shape. You've been taught in different ways that God's presence should feel noticeable, that when He is near, you'll sense it, that when He is working, you'll see it. And when those things don't happen, it creates a gap between expectation and reality, and that gap feels like absence. But what if silence isn't the absence of God? What if it's something else entirely? Because throughout Scripture, there are moments where God is clearly present, yet not immediately visible or audible. Moments where people are waiting, questioning, even struggling, yet God has not stepped away. He's still working, just not in ways that can be easily felt or understood in the moment. And that changes everything. Because if God's work is not always obvious, then your current experience may not be what it seems. The silence you're feeling might not be emptiness. It might be depth. Think about how uncomfortable silence can feel. In your daily life, silence often signals something is wrong. It creates uncertainty. It makes you wonder what's happening behind the scenes. Your mind tries to fill in the gaps, often with fear or worst-case scenarios. And spiritually, it's no different. When God feels silent, your thoughts try to explain it. Maybe He's distant. Maybe I've done something wrong. Maybe He's not going to answer this time. But those explanations, they come from your mind, not from truth. Because the truth is, God's silence has never meant His absence. In fact, some of the deepest work God does in your life happens in seasons where you don't feel Him at all. Not because He's hiding from you, but because He's developing something in you that doesn't depend on constant reassurance. This is where faith begins to mature. Because it's one thing to trust God when you feel His presence. It's another thing entirely to trust Him when you don't. And that kind of trust doesn't grow in noise, it grows in silence. But let's be honest, that's not easy to accept. Because silence forces you to sit with uncertainty. It removes the emotional confirmation you've been relying on. It challenges the part of you that wants immediate clarity, immediate answers, immediate relief. And without those things, your mind starts searching for control again. You start overthinking, trying to figure everything out, trying to predict outcomes, trying to solve problems that don't yet have answers. Because if God isn't speaking in a way you can hear, it feels like it's up to you to figure things out on your own. But that's not what's happening. The silence is not a sign that you've been left alone. It's a space where something unseen is taking place. Just because you don't hear movement doesn't mean nothing is moving. Just because you don't feel change doesn't mean nothing is changing. There's a deeper layer to God's work. that doesn't always reach your emotions immediately, one that operates beneath the surface, shaping your perspective, strengthening your trust, preparing you for things you don't yet see. And if that's true, then the silence you've been fearing might actually be intentional, not to distance you, but to deepen you. But this leads to another tension. If God is still present, if He is still working, if the silence is not empty, then why does your mind keep drifting toward fear? Why do your thoughts keep pulling you back into anxiety? Even when you're trying to trust Him, why does it feel like there's a constant battle happening internally between what you're starting to understand and what your mind keeps telling you? Because even if your perspective begins to shift, your thoughts don't automatically follow. And that reveals something important. The real struggle may not be God's silence. It may be what is happening inside your mind while He is silent. There is a battle happening inside you, and it's not always obvious at first. It doesn't look like a battle on the outside. You're still going through your routines, still handling responsibilities, still showing up where you need to be. But internally, something is constantly pulling at your attention, your thoughts. They don't stay still for long. One thought leads to another, and before you realize it, your mind is already 10 steps at imagining outcomes, replaying situations, questioning decisions, anticipating problems that haven't even happened yet. And the more you try to quiet it, the louder it seems to become. You tell yourself to stop overthinking. You try to focus on what's real, what's in front of you. But then another thought appears, and another. And suddenly, you're back in that same psychoanalyzing, worrying, trying to regain control. It's exhausting because it feels like your mind is working against you. But here's something important to understand. Your mind is not the enemy, but it is a battlefield. That means the issue is not that you have thoughts. The issue is which thoughts you allow to take root. Because not every thought that enters your mind is true. Not every thought deserves your agreement. And not every thought reflects reality the way it actually is. But when you're overwhelmed, it becomes harder to tell the difference. Fear-based thoughts start to feel logical. Worst-case scenarios start to feel likely. Doubt starts to feel like wisdom. And slowly, without even realizing it, your perspective begins to shift, not based on truth, but based on repetition. Because the thoughts you entertain the most are the ones that shape your internal reality. And this is where the tension becomes real. You may believe in God. You may know truth on a deeper level. But if your mind is constantly feeding you something different, it creates a disconnect between what you believe and what you experience. That's why you can know that God is in control and still feel out of control. You can know that He is with you and still feel alone. You can know that everything will work together for good and still feel like things are falling apart because your thoughts are speaking louder than your beliefs in those moments. And if nothing interrupts that pattern, fear begins to grow. Not because your situation is necessarily getting worse, but because your mind is reinforcing a version of reality that is disconnected from truth. This is why Scripture places so much emphasis on the renewal of the mind, not as a suggestion, but as a necessity. Because if your mind is left unchecked, it will naturally drift toward fear, not faith. Not because you're weak, but because your mind is trying to protect you. It's trying to predict outcomes, avoid pain, prepare for the worst. But in doing so, it often pulls you away from trust and into control. And control, in this context, is an illusion. You can think through every possible outcome and still not have certainty. You can prepare for every scenario and still feel anxious. Because peace doesn't come from figuring everything out. It comes from trusting the one who already has. But how do you actually live that out? Because it's one thing to recognize that your thoughts are shaping your experience. It's another thing to interrupt them when they feel so automatic. This is where many people feel stuck. You don't choose the first thought that enters your mind. It just shows up. Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's doubt. Sometimes it's a quiet sense of dread that you can't fully explain. But what you do choose is what happens next. Do you agree with it? Do you dwell on it? Do you let it expand and define how you see everything else? Or do you pause and bring it back to truth? That pause, that moment of awareness is where transformation begins. Because renewing your mind is not about never having negative thoughts. It's about not letting those thoughts lead you. It's about learning to recognize when your mind is drifting and gently, consistently bringing it back. Not with pressure, not with frustration, but with intention. And this takes practice. It might feel unnatural at first, because your mind has been conditioned to respond a certain way. It has patterns, habits, automatic reactions that have been reinforced over time. But those patterns are not permanent. They can be and every time you choose to align your thoughts with truth instead of fear, something shifts, even if you don't feel it immediately. But here's where the struggle continues. Even when you begin to manage your thoughts better, even when you start to create space between fear and truth, there are still moments where nothing changes externally. The situation you're worried about is still unresolved. The answers you're waiting for still haven't come. And that brings you back to a familiar place, waiting. And if you're honest, waiting might be one of the hardest parts of all. Waiting has a way of exposing everything you're trying to hold together. It's not just about time passing. It's about what happens inside you while nothing seems to be happening around you. It's the space between prayer and answer, between hope and fulfillment, between where you are and where you thought you would be by now. And if you're honest, this is where your faith feels the most fragile. Because it's one thing to trust God when things are moving, when doors are opening, when clarity is coming, when you can see progressive in if it's small, but when everything feels still, when nothing seems to be changing, when the same questions remain unanswered day after day, that's when waiting starts to feel heavy. Not just emotionally, but spiritually. You begin to wonder things you don't always say out loud. Did I hear God wrong? Is this ever going to change? Why does it feel like I'm stuck? And slowly, waiting stops feeling like a season and starts feeling like a dead end. But here's where perspective becomes everything. Because waiting, as uncomfortable as it is, has never been empty. It feels empty. It feels like nothing is happening. But that feeling is not the full picture. There's a difference between something being unseen and something not existing. And in your life right now, much of what God is doing falls into that unseen space. The kind of work that doesn't immediately show up in your circumstances, but is shaping something deeper within you. This is where growth happens that can't be rushed. Because if everything came instant, answers, clarity, direction, you would never develop the kind of trust that remains steady when things don't make sense. Waiting stretches your faith in a way that quick answers never could. But that doesn't make it easy, because while God may be working in ways you can't see, you're still living in the tension of not knowing. You still have to wake up each day without full clarity. You still have to move forward without having everything figured out. You still have to trust without having all the evidence you wish you had. And that can feel exhausting, because your mind keeps trying to resolve what hasn't been resolved yet. It keeps asking for answers that haven't come. It keeps trying to close a loop that God hasn't closed yet. And when that happens, frustration begins to build, not just because of the situation, but because of the lack of movement. You start to feel like you're doing something wrong simply because nothing is changing. But what if waiting is not a sign that you're off track? What if it's actually part of how God keeps you on track? Because waiting does something that immediate answers cannot. It reveals what you are relying on when there are no quick solutions, no visible progress, no emotional reassurance. You begin to see what your faith is really anchored in. Is it anchored in outcomes? Is it anchored in feelings? Or is it anchored in God, even when everything else feels uncertain? This is where waiting becomes more than just a delay. It becomes a process of refinement, not to test you in a way that pushes you away, but to strengthen something in you that will carry you further than you can see right now. But here's the tension you're still holding. If waiting is part of growth, why does it feel like you're losing strength in the process? Why does it feel like the longer you wait, the more tired you become, the more your thoughts wander, the more your emotions fluctuate, the more you question what you once felt sure about? Because if waiting is supposed to build faith, Why does it sometimes feel like it's weakening it? That question matters because it reveals something deeper. It shows that maybe the goal isn't for you to become stronger in the way you expected, but to discover a different kind of strength altogether. A strength that doesn't come from having answers. A strength that doesn't come from feeling confident. A strength that doesn't come from everything making sense, but a strength that comes from something else entirely. Something that begins to take shape when you finally reach the point where you realize you can't carry everything on your own anymore. There comes a moment, usually not dramatic, not loud, not even visible from the outside, when something inside you begins to shift. It doesn't happen because everything suddenly makes sense. It doesn't happen because your circumstances change overnight. In fact, most of the time, nothing around you looks different at all. But internally, something softens. It's the moment where you begin to realize that the weight you've been carrying was never meant to be carried the way you've been carrying it. For so long, you've been trying to hold everything together, trying to manage your thoughts, control outcomes, figure out the future, maintain your faith, and keep your emotions from falling apart all at the same time. And if you're honest, it's exhausting. Not just physically, but mentally and spiritually. Because deep down, you know you weren't created to live in constant pressure. You weren't designed to sustain yourself through your own understanding, your own strength, your own ability to make sense of everything. And yet, that's what you've been trying to do. Not because you wanted to replace God, but because, in the silence, it felt like you had to. It felt like if you didn't figure things out, no one would. It felt like if you didn't stay on top of everything, things would fall apart. It felt like if you didn't keep pushing, you would fall behind. But here's the truth that begins to break through in this moment. You were never meant to carry what only God can hold. And this is where surrender begins. Not as a last resort, but as a necessary step. Because surrender is often misunderstood. It's not giving up. It's not becoming passive. It's not ignoring reality or pretending things don't matter. Surrender is releasing the need to control what was never in your control to begin with. It's the quiet decision to stop striving for certainty and start trusting God even without it. And that's not easy, because control feels safe, even when it's exhausting. It gives you the illusion that you're doing something, that you're managing the outcome, that you're protecting yourself from the unknown. But the more you try to control everything, the heavier it becomes, until eventually you reach a point where you can't carry it the same way anymore. And that's where something new becomes possible. Because when you let go of control, not perfectly, not all at once, but intentionally, you create space. Space for peace that doesn't come from answers. Space for trust that doesn't depend on clarity. Space for God to be God, without you trying to take His place in your own life. And this is the turning point. It's subtle, but powerful. You begin to shift from asking, how do I fix everything, to asking, how do I trust God in this? You move from trying to eliminate uncertainty to learning how to live with it without being consumed by it. You stop measuring your strength by how stable you feel and start recognizing that your strength is coming from something deeper. And slowly, something begins to settle inside you. Not because everything is resolved, but because you're no longer trying to resolve everything on your own. There's a quiet release, a moment where you realize, I don't need to have all the answers right now. I don't need to feel strong to be held together. I don't need to control the outcome to trust that God is in control. And that realization, it changes the way you carry everything. The pressure begins to lift, not all at once, but gradually. Your thoughts may still come, but they don't define you the same way. Your emotions may still fluctuate, but they don't control your direction. Your circumstances may still be uncertain, but they don't shake your foundation the same way. Because something deeper has taken root. Trust. Not the kind of trust that feels intense or emotional, but the kind that is steady, quiet, consistent. The kind that doesn't need constant reassurance to remain. And this is where you begin to understand something that once felt out of reach. You don't need to feel strong to actually be strong. because your strength was never meant to come from your ability to hold everything together. It comes from God holding you together. And when that truth settles into your heart, not just intellectually, but deeply, you start to experience something that doesn't depend on circumstances. A kind of peace that doesn't require everything to make sense. A kind of stability that doesn't disappear when emotions rise. A kind of confidence that isn't rooted in control, but in trust. And from this place, you're finally ready to see what strength really looks like. Now you begin to see it differently. Not all at once, not perfectly, but clearly enough to realize that something inside you has changed. The situation may still be the same. The questions may not all be answered. The future may still feel uncertain in many ways, but the way you carry it, that's where the transformation has happened. Because before, everything felt like pressure. Pressure to understand, pressure to fix, pressure to feel strong, pressure to have unwavering faith without struggle, without doubt, without weakness. And when you couldn't meet that standard, it made you feel like you were falling short, not just in life, but in your relationship with God. But now, that weight is no longer sitting on your shoulders the same way, because you've come to understand something that changes everything. God never asked you to be strong on your own. He never required you to have perfect emotions. He never expected you to navigate life without moments of fear, doubt, or exhaustion. What he invites you into is something deeper. Dependence, not as weakness, but as the foundation of true strength. And this is where the shift becomes real. You no longer see your weakness as something that disqualifies you. You begin to see it as the very place where God meets you. Not when you have everything together, but when you realize you don't have to. There's a quiet confidence that starts to grow. Not loud, not dramatic, not based on feelings, but steady. You still have moments where your mind tries to pull you back into You still have days where emotions feel heavy. You still encounter uncertainty, delays, and questions that don't have immediate answers. But now, those things don't define you the same way, because your foundation has shifted. You're no longer standing on how you feel. You're standing on truth. And that truth is simple, but powerful. God is with you even when you don't feel him. God is working even when you don't see it. God is sustaining you even when you feel weak. And because of that, you're not as fragile as you once thought. You're being held. That realization brings a different kind of peace. Not the kind that removes all challenges, but the kind that remains in the middle of them. You don't need everything to be resolved to feel grounded. You don't need constant clarity to keep moving forward. You don't need emotional certainty to trust God with your life, because your strength is no longer coming from those things. It's coming from him. And that changes how you walk through everything. You move forward, but not with pressure. You trust, but not because everything makes sense. You continue, but not because you feel strong every moment. You continue because you know you are not alone. And maybe, for the first time in a while, your mind feels a little quieter. Not completely silent, but calmer, less urgent, less overwhelmed. Because it's no longer trying to carry what it was never meant to carry. You've released the need to control everything. You've let go of the idea that strength must be felt to be real. You've stopped measuring your faith by your emotions. And in that release, something steady has taken its place. This is what real strength looks like. It's not loud. It's not always visible. But it's there in your willingness to trust God again today. In your decision to keep going, even without all the answers. In your choice to believe truth, even when your feelings try to say otherwise. That is strength, and it's already growing inside you. So if you've been questioning yourself,